5 minutes to go time, Fred. Three-minute warning. Two-minute warning.
I'm going to start.
1 minute warning.
we're just doing a really quick test of the live stream to make sure it's working. So, Chris, you shouldn't be able to see my face right now, but you should hear my voice if you're on the live stream. All good. Okay. If anybody's jumped on the live stream, on the YouTube live stream, welcome, and we'll be with you just a minute. I think we'll give just another minute for the folks who are right on time, just like church, Sunday morning. And for those jumping on the live stream, welcome. We'll be with you in just a minute. All right, well, we'll get started. For those of you who are here, and there might be a few more trickling in the back, so if we have a Federated folk or two, maybe we could just check and see if, or Laura, you can see if you see anybody else coming in. Thank you. Thank you for those of you who are here in person, for those of you who are joining us via the live stream. This event this evening is sort of the culmination of ongoing conversations that have been taking place between the Federated Church of Sycamore, the First Congregational Church in DeKalb, and Mayfield Congregational UCC here in Sycamore, as well as we continue to talk about how we might partner together to bear witness to the tradition that we are a part of, in particular that we share, the United Church of Christ, in this community. And as we seek to say, what do we hold in common? How might we build relationships? And how might we bear witness to the sort of gospel proclamation, the message that is at the center of our faith in a more public or visible way? And so that the community can know there are many different kinds of Christian voices, Christian witnesses out there. And one of the things that sometimes our sort of more quote-unquote progressive churches have not done well is be visible, be in the community, and for people to know that
We lost the sound.
a partnership in this. For those of you who are a part of, I'm glad for your work, your witness in your congregation, and for you being here tonight. And if you're joining us either online in the live stream or you're here in the sanctuary and you're just sort of checking things out and you don't know any of our churches, your way here, welcome. I know that tonight's topic, we're speaking important, timely moment in the national conversation, where we are as a country, where we are as a world. And I know we're in a very polarized, very intensely divided time. And so part of the hope for tonight and for next week, if you can join us, we're going to be out in Dutton Hall next week and in small groups, taking this conversation to the next level. We'll say more about that at the end as we wrap this up, but to continue asking, to get a better understanding of what Christian nationalism is, so that we can better know how to respond in our own lives as churches in the wider community. So thank you for being here tonight. I want to thank Fred for being here with us tonight, and John is going to introduce Fred to you all.
Fred's a very important figure, not just in my life personally, but in American culture more broadly. Fred began tracking the work of the religious right back in the early 1980s. His book, Eternal Hostilities, was a landmark book on the machinations of the religious right. He developed a blog that he had other investigative journalists contribute to called Talk to Action, where daily they were posting information about what was happening. I was asked back in 2005 to do some research by the Council of Conference Ministers of the United Church of Christ on what was happening in churches across the country, United Churches of Christ, who felt like they were under attack. I did that. It produced a book out of that, but it was linking up with Fred Clarkson, not just with the research that he had been doing, but conversations that I began to have with him that enabled me and leaders of the United Church of Christ to understand more fully what was actually going on. Well, here we are in 2024. Fred is now a senior research analyst for the Political Research Associates. He's had a number of positions with important journals, magazines, articles published, books written through the years, but this has been his primary focus. We are extraordinarily fortunate to have him with us here this evening. Twice in the last 3 weeks, I've heard him do presentations to national audiences on this subject. He is as well researched in this as anybody I know. He comes at it not only through the lens of an investigative journalist, without bias, but also through the lens of somebody who is passionate as an American citizen about our democracy. And a part of his message is not to allow theocracy to displace democracy. First, the last thing I want to say in introduction is a very personal thank you to Fred for being here tonight, but for his now decades of work on this. One last thing. It is a matter of great integrity for me as a religious leader not to be partisan with my religious voice or the office that I hold. I don't see what we're doing tonight as in any way partisan. I believe that it is the responsibility of faithful disciples of Christ to stand up and say that Christian nationalism is not an articulation of the gospel that represents our faith. And those of us who continue to believe in an America dedicated to the separation of church and state have to stand with a clear voice in opposition to what Christian nationalism is asking people to believe about what it means to be Christian. And because of that, voices like Fred become incredibly meaningful. So, Fred, thank you.
Well, thank you, John and Eric, for your kind introduction and having me here tonight. It's certainly true. I've been at this for a long time, and I wish it didn't turn out that way. but we still have a lot of work to do as a society, and with big aspirations in front of us, and the defense of all of the successes we've had in moving democratic aspiration forward. So it's good to be with you this evening, although I wish it were under happier circumstances. But I'm grateful to be able to share some of what I've learned about the ideological development of the Christian right over the years. and how it has shaped our political moment. Now, when I talk about conservative Christians, I'm certainly not talking about all Christians who happen to be politically or theologically conservative. I'm speaking about a movement that does not support religious equality and constitutional democracy as we've come to understand it over the past quarter millennium, and are active opponents of a just society for all. This is a story of a movement that has long seen itself as part of a gathering storm. It's led by smart, educated activists dedicated to a theocratic vision that has before and could easily again include violence. In the next few minutes, I want to do a quick overview of some of the development of some key strategic ideas and identify some of the key strategists who conceived of and implemented them, and discuss a bit about what we're facing today. But before I do, I want to tell you that as dire as some of this may sound, the bad news is good, and the reason is simple. Ancient Chinese poet and military philosopher Sun Tzu said, "You do not attack the enemy, you attack the enemy's strategy." Now, we may not want to think of our fellow Americans as the enemy. We might prefer to think of them as formidable opponents or adversaries, but the principle is the same. So the good news is that we actually know a lot about the strategy of our formidable opponents. And while we only have time to talk about some of it here, I want to highlight my main takeaway point in advance. Acquiring and applying knowledge about the strategy of our formidable adversaries gives us an advantage in all of the struggles for justice in which we're engaged. I want to say that again. Acquiring and applying knowledge about the strategy of our formidable adversaries gives us an advantage in all of the struggles for justice in which we are engaged. And if you've got that, now I can go home. But that said, I want to tell you a story about certain conservative Christians, a remnant who felt that they were losing everything to which they had aspired. It was the 60s. The mainline Protestant denominations were becoming more liberal. The civil rights movement was advancing. It was, as was the women's movement, and abortion and LGBTQ rights were on the horizon. Hippies and others were challenging authority. All this and more. It was a tough time. Right-thinking conservatives pined for the restoration of the Christian nation they imagined had been the intention of God and the founding fathers. But they had a problem. If there were to be such a Christian nation, what would it be like, and how would they get there? Fortunately, an American theologian named R.J. Rushdoony had been working on it. In 1973, he published the first volume of the Institutes of Biblical Law. This work is a foundational part of the Christian right in all of its manifestations. Rushdoony's vision, called Christian Reconstructionism, proposes that contemporary application of the laws of Old Testament Israel, or biblical law, should be the basis for reconstructing society toward the kingdom of God on earth. It argues that the Bible is to be the governing text for all areas of life, and they've formulated a biblical worldview and biblical principles by which to examine contemporary matters. The work of the Christian Reconstructionist authors provided at once a biblical justification for involvement in politics, as well as a program for what a biblical society might look like. Not everybody in the Christian right completely agrees with them, but everyone who's serious about politics and government has to measure themselves by Rushdoony's standard, because his is the only one. One Christian Reconstructionist theologian said, "The Christian goal for the world is the universal development of biblical theocratic republics, in which every area of life is redeemed and placed under the lordship of Jesus Christ and the rule of God's law." Now, a lot of people never heard of Rushdoony, but journalist Bill Moyers understood how central he was to the political development of the Christian right, and in 1987 scored the only mainstream interview, television interview with him that the media-wary Rushdoony ever recorded. And you can still find that PBS interview online if you look for it. Now, some have argued that the Reconstructionists are few in number and therefore can't be all that important. And while it's true that there are not a lot of people who have ever publicly identified as Christian Reconstructionists, their significance has never been in their numbers, but in the power of their ideas, often encapsulated by the idea of the biblical worldview. In fact, they've provided much of the intellectual firepower for the Christian right for the past half century. Now, I'm old enough to remember the early days of the militant direct action group Operation Rescue, led by Randall Terry. They, like other militant activists, were inspired by Presbyterian Reformed theologian Francis Schaeffer. He believed that Christians must stand up to the tyranny of the state to defend the unborn. He advocated the kind of direct action taken against clinics in the 1980s and 90s. Randall Terry said, "You have to read Schaeffer's Christian Manifesto if you want to understand Operation Rescue." But the thing about Schaeffer is that he stopped short of proposing what to do beyond protesting and trying to prevent abortion care. Anti-abortion activists were left to wonder, well, what else? What's next? What else can we do? So Terry, like many of his peers, became influenced by Christian Reconstructionism. He even became an advocate for theocratic revolution. The evolution of his thought was clear in his 1995 book, The Sword, The Blessing of Righteous Government and the Overthrow of Tyrants. Now, during all this time, he wasn't the only one trying to figure out how to be the right kind of Christian, because there was a tectonic shift going on in the theologies of the evangelical world. Now, please forgive my very simplified version of this complicated history, but fortunately, our story benefits from the complexities having been largely sorted through for us by the people who lived it. Now, the evangelical world was long dominated by the theology of premillennialism, which, for practical purposes, meant that the world could not be much changed until Jesus returned. This view restrained political activism since the church was essentially warning against it. Postmillennialists, which is what the Christian Reconstructionists are, believe that the world must become more perfectly Christian in order for Jesus to return, thus requiring political action. So in 1982, to resolve these things, a series of theological discussions were launched under the auspices of an entity called the Coalition on Revival. This included prominent figures from all the camps, including Rushdoony and Schaeffer. The process produced many papers and manifestos, but there is one important upshot for our purposes here today. People agreed to disagree about the timing of the second coming of Jesus. They also agreed to disagree how much could be accomplished before Jesus returned. And they did agree that it was the obligation of Christians to try to make the world better and more fully Christian. Thus, the door was now open to political action, just a crack, but it was enough for much of the evangelical world to come through at their own speeds and attain unprecedented levels of political activism, and that process is still underway today. It's been the ongoing discussion of Christian Reconstructionism and its applicability to various strands of evangelical theology that allowed for the major organizations of the Christian right to form, from Jerry Falwell's Moral Majority through Pat Robertson's Christian Coalition to Tony Perkins' Family Research Council of today, and more. Another prominent participant in the coalition revival process was theologian C. Peter Wagner. He was a church professor of church growth at Fuller Theological Seminary. But Wagner observed that churches outside denominational structures were the fastest growing worldwide. They were mostly Pentecostal or charismatic, and in them, he and associates saw an emerging new paradigm that they eventually sought to shape, organize, and lead. In the late 1990s, they created a number of national and international networks, a training academy called Wagner University, which you can still find online, and convened an international hub of national networks, now called the International Coalition of Apostolic Leaders, with networks in 85 countries. Now, contrary to some popular narratives, they're not all white. In fact, the movement is multiracial, multi-ethnic, and multinational, and often has women in leadership. Now, they consider, that is to say, the New Apostolic Reformation folks that just referred to, consider the Coalition on Revival materials key parts of their teaching. Wagner called their movement the New Apostolic Reformation. This movement epitomizes much of what COR, Coalition Revival, sought to achieve, fusing the experientially oriented Pentecostal and charismatic experience with elements of the systematic theology of Christian Reconstructionism and other dominionist sources. Wagner makes this explicit in his 2008 book, Dominion. He also made clear that he did not view the movement as limited to the networks that he and his colleagues created. So to this day, there are, for example, apostles such as Paula White Cain, Donald Trump's longtime spiritual advisor, who are not part of those networks. Now, that's Paula White Cain on Trump's right shoulder, the very blonde hair, Apostle Guillermo Maldonado on his left, and Apostle Harry Jackson right behind him. And the movement continues to spread far beyond Wagner's direct legacy institutions. This can be seen, for example, in NAR's Seven Mountain Mandate, which Wagner detailed in his book Dominion. The simple metaphor of the seven mountains makes this religious and political vision accessible and easy to understand for wide audiences, many of whom have never heard of Wagner or the NAR. What's more, many of those audiences are not even Pentecostal or charismatic. Now, this serious scholarly poll found that the notion of the seven mountains has been spreading and now dominates evangelical Christianity, even beyond the portion of evangelicals in the charismatic and Pentecostal camp. Now, I want to pull back from our story for a moment. These big ideas, Christian Reconstructionism, Dominionism, New Apostolic Reformation, Seven Mountains, why do we, or anybody really, needs to know all that? And the reason is simple. These are the key ideas that have allowed the Christian right to become the political powerhouse that has changed history. These are the ideas that animated the movement that got enough political power to overturn Roe v. Wade and is poised to change Supreme Court decisions, other groundbreaking decisions that have advanced civil and human rights over the past century. They have the power and they intend to use it. Christian right is the best organized faction in American politics and reaches into both major parties, although they're obviously more deeply involved in the Republican Party. One of the remarkable aspects of this is a strategic thought that I think defines an important part of our religious and political moment and probably affects all of us. Now, Gary North was a Christian Reconstructionist thinker, prolific author, and political strategist, and a participant in the Coalition Revival. He was also an astute observer and analyst of his opponents, people like us. He saw that we tend to experience what he called the dilemma of democratic pluralism. And he explained that the same constitutional doctrines that protect religious and political beliefs and expression also protect those who oppose them. Our philosophy, we can say that, extends protection even to those who believe that those of us who hold, quote, a rival view should not be allowed to vote. North observed that convicted felons are denied the right to vote, and that the same standard should be applied to, quote, those who hold religious or ideological views that would threaten the very foundations of Christian civilization, as he sees it, of course. And the Christian right is skilled at tactically exploiting our discomfort with this. Now, I want to return us to the New Apostolic Reformation and the broad strategy of the Christian right. Keeping in mind that for decades, the main strategy of the Christian right has always been to master the tools of electoral democracy in order to erode and to end it. Over the past several election cycles, the percentage of white evangelicals in the electorate has risen from 23% to actually it's numbers different, from 13% to 28%, even as their percentage of the population has decreased from 23% to 13%. This remarkable accomplishment is the result of smart political organizing, as well as the theological processes that have allowed them, given permission to be more politically engaged. A fresh iteration of the strategy was announced in July of 2023, when an NAR leader, Apostle Lance Wallnau, and the America First Policy Institute, a MAGA think tank in Washington, launched what they called Project 19. Wallnau says they're engaged in the battle for the mountain of government. Now, they knew that their candidate for president in 2020 had lost by only a few thousand votes in key states. And they aim to make up the difference this time. The strategy targets suburban counties in 9 swing states where the evangelical vote in 2020 was proportionately less than elsewhere. Wallnau and NAR evangelist Mario Murillo have staged events in 5 states, on what they call the Courage Tour. They've been seeking to identify and recruit prospective voters and activists to turn out evangelicals to make blue counties more purple. In Arizona, Wallnow sought to find and train electoral activists in the Latinx precincts in Maricopa County. There, they wanted to contact unregistered and infrequently voting Christians with a name to plan for early voting. Now, the rules for early voting vary from state to state, but in Arizona, it begins almost 4 weeks before Election Day, giving organizers plenty of time to get their voters to the polls. Now, in this slide, you see Wallnow explaining, while the Vita Church pastor Benjamin Diaz translates, how to find voters in the key precincts, identified by number on the map. These precincts, he says, are within striking distance of the church to where the devil's got a stronghold that God wants to break up. This reflects the broad strategy of the Christian right, which believes that some 30 to 40 million evangelicals don't vote. It's a much more targeted approach now. But what's more, unlike in past elections, for the past 2 years, they've focused on registering people early, having them apply for absentee or mail-in ballots so that they will make up their numbers with early voters and can concentrate their efforts on voter turnout in the home stretch. Now, while Wallnow was focused on 5 target counties, the wider coalition of which he's a part focused on the other 14 and applied the basic principles of their strategy to other areas as well. Suggesting how important the NAR constituency is seen by politicians, Wallnow's most recent 2-day rally and training in Pennsylvania drew J.D. Vance, who staged a town hall with them. Now, I'm about to show you a slide from a recent essay by Mario Murillo, Lance Wallnow's partner in the Courage Tour. It's about Kamala Harris, but there is a broader context. Over the past few years, there's been an escalation in the rhetoric of violence from these circles, possible civil war and possible end times religious war. And while there's no indications that the movement is specifically organizing for violence, they cast themselves as God's heroes in a looming ultimate showdown in which they may be supernaturally empowered and join forces with a legion of angels against demonic forces. My former colleague, Chip Relay, Political Research Associates, wrote a paper about this kind of visioning titled, "Heroes Know Which Villains to Kill: How Coded Rhetoric Incites Scripted Violence." Now notice the Harris figure's followers are demons in front of a tattered American flag. It's a paradox, isn't it? That the ordinary activities of electoral politics are being driven by the psychology of imminent war with transcendent evil. Now, I show this slide because it epitomizes what NAR leaders are teaching their followers about the rest of us, not just Harris voters, and to emphasize that the way forward is not to allow this material to psych us out. In the short run, we need to stay focused on the stability of constitutional democracy, upholding the dignity and rights of all. Over the long run, we will need to find ways to de-demonize ourselves to our fellow Americans and to de-escalate the growing conflict and the threat to democracy. Therefore, I want to close with a quiet call to action. It's not a call to do things we've done before that haven't worked, but this time with more energy. I suggest that to deal with the politics of the NAR and the broader Christian right, that we need to reconcile ourselves with the fact that we need to know more than we do now about who they are and what they're about. If knowledge is power, we need more knowledge, and we need to spread it more widely. We also need some agreed upon vocabulary in order to be able to discuss the knowledge we acquire. This is how good strategy is made, not some other way, this way. We also need to deepen our knowledge of the rules and practices of electoral democracy and broaden the community of people and leaders who have integrated these things more deeply into our culture. We should not be content to leave these things to political professionals. Over the longer run, we're going to need to turn ourselves to the problem of how we are seen by our fellow citizens. That the picture of the demons, ought to haunt us for some time. Now, I agree with scholar Matt Taylor, who has a new book out on the NAR, when he says, much of the challenge of living in a pluralist, multiracial, multi-religious democracy, which draws on the best values and best hopes for the American project, is to resist this gravitational pull toward dehumanization. This must include not dehumanizing people who might be actively dehumanizing you. Down that path lie madness and civil war. But this is part of the dilemma of democratic pluralism I mentioned earlier. And the more we come to recognize the nature of the dilemma that we live every day, if we're conscious of the things that are going on around us, will increase our capacity to reach better outcomes. Now, having said all this, I want to raise one more concern. In case you think that the targets of the NIR and the broader Christian right are limited to religious, racial, and gender minorities, I urge you to consider that they have other targets as well. Beginning with other Christians and churches they may not consider to be quite correct. But I want to get into this briefly because of something that really just happened. Sean Foyt is an NAR political activist and troubadour who conducts rallies all over the country and often appears in evangelical media. In this case, with controversial author Mark Driscoll. During the course of their discussion, both Foyt and Driscoll asserted that Vice President Kamala Harris's success in the presidential election and in the debate is due to demonic power. There's some serious demonic sorcery, witchcraft thing going on here that would even remotely make this race tight, because for 3.5 years, these guys have destroyed America on every level, Foyt claimed. Driscoll then attacked Harris for being a member of the American Baptist Church, which he said is completely apostate and a completely anti-God denomination that is an abomination. Driscoll likewise attacked Tim Walz for being a member of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which he says is a completely apostate, completely antichrist denomination. These are people who profess to be Christians, Driscoll said. They go to churches that are synagogues of Satan. Is there not a demonic spirit that is trying to get someone who is antichrist, but a member of a church and denomination to put a political office, he asked? If they win, you are going to have literally two people who are antichrist but claim to be Christians and members of the church pulling the levers for the United States of America for 4 years. It's nefarious, Driscoll proclaimed. It's horrifying. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Fred. This is John, and you and I carry on a little bit of a conversation before we open the floor up for questions from the audience.
Sure.
First, thank you. This is absolutely sobering. I've heard this for more than 20 years from you, and it's still chilling to the bone to hear you rehearse for us all that you've discovered in your years of journalistic integrity about this. Did you ever know Andrew Weaver, who was doing research on this for the United Methodists?
I did. We talked often, and he published a number of pieces that talked to action at the same time you were contributing.
That's right. And after our book came out, he and I traveled together and did presentations on this. I want to quote him and maybe get a comment from you on that. You've already talked a little bit about this. He used to say in his presentations to the audience, they're playing tackle football and we're playing touch football, and we're going to lose this game every time. Comment a little bit about what Andrew meant by that and what you think that suggests to us in ways of wise responses to what we're experiencing here.
Well, there was some years ago at the same time, I was talking to Presbyterians who were having the same kind of problem. under internal and external attack. And there were folks who wanted common ground. They wanted to seek common ground. They wanted to resolve differences with their brothers and sisters in Christ. But, it was very difficult for them. And I think it's difficult for many members of the mainline churches, the Methodists, the UCC, to accept the idea that there are people with malevolent intentions, in the membership, people who are working without outside interests for a variety of reasons. And the first thing is that people need to accept this as a possibility. You don't want to become paranoid and pointing fingers at everybody, but this has been the history of the past several decades. It's reality. It's one of the reasons why churches are in so much conflict and in schism and people running away. People don't want to come to a community in order to fight all the time. But these folks are good at making places unpleasant and uncomfortable because by creating those fights. So figure out, all right, well, who is behind this? Who are the people who are doing these things and developing appropriate strategies to contend with it? Begins with acceptance, and then it begins with the kind of knowledge and research that you gained in looking around what was happening to the UCC, and Andrew gained in understanding the Methodists. There's really no choice here, because this is the reality. We can't turn our heads away from it.
So I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but after that conversation, say something about our mutual friends, the Institute on Religion and Democracy.
Well, sure. Back in the late 70s and early 80s, conservative philanthropy, if we can call them that, created the idea of strategic conservative philanthropy. And they began to work together to figure out what kinds of institutions they needed to wage the kinds of fights and to build the kind of movement and the kind of society that they wanted to see. And one of these strategic think tanks they created was something called the Institute on Religion and Democracy. And their focus was on the social witness of three main denominations: the Episcopal Church, the Methodists, and then the PCUSA, and worked with internal conservative factions and anti-abortion factions and the charismatic factions to raise turmoil in the churches. And they did so very effectively, essentially functioning as an outside agency waging a covert operation against the legitimacy and the institutional capacity of the major Protestant denominations in the United States. But the others were not to be left out either, because they created something called the Association for Church Renewal, which was an association of all of the dissident factions in the mainline denominations. And they've helped to facilitate disruptive behavior by a variety of groups, including those functioning within the UCC. Now, one of the things that was most remarkable about this, and I'll stop in just a moment, and that is that the IRD was not run just by conservatives who were unhappy about the liberal direction of the denominations. They were also included evangelical leaders and even Catholics. Robert P. George, a leading Catholic neoconservative strategist, was on the board. Marianne McClendon, who later became the George Bush's ambassador to the Vatican, and other Catholic leaders were on the board of directors trying to help the Protestants get their social witness right. We have never seen such a well-organized, well-funded attack on major mainstream religious institutions anytime in American history.
At the risk of the two of us coming across as sort of conspiracy nuts, I'm going to push one more question on this. And anybody that wants to ask me questions later about this, I've written a book about it. You mentioned covert operations. I don't want to go again too far down this rabbit hole, but just remind folk who runs the IRD and who trained him in covert operations.
I'm not sure what you're referring to here.
Mark Tooley.
Oh yeah, Mark Tooley is the current president of the RID. He ran their Methodist program for many years, and immediately prior to his employment at IRD, doing the Methodist program, he, I think for 25 years, had been an analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency, focusing on Central America.
Right. These last couple of questions focused on that last slide you had, which talked a lot about how some Christians see other Christians and feel empowered by God to do these covert operations and other things in order not just to discredit them, but to eliminate them from the equation. This last question, and then we'll open it up to questions others have, is going to focus us back on the attention of Christian nationalism writ more broadly, which is the undermining not of mainline Protestant Christianity in the church as we know it, but the undermining of democracy as we know it. And I'm going to refer to another mutual friend of ours, Michelle Goldberg, who in her book, Kingdom Coming, The Rise of Christian Nationalism, talked about the role of Liberty University, talked about the role of that university graduating law students trained in the rewriting of constitutional law through the lens of Old Testament scripture, going back to R.J. Rushdoony. But what I want you to just talk a little bit about, which Michelle does in the book, is how effective they have been in placing their graduates in key political positions, including the White House.
Well, sure. The same phenomenon Michelle talks about also happened at Pat Robertson's Regent University, where I met students on the campus, walking out of law class, carrying the Institutes of Biblical Law with them, and they were taught, the regular constitutional law, but they also had to learn Rushdoony, because if they were going to become Christian lawyers, they needed to be able to do both. So yes, we've seen a generation of law school graduates entering American law and American politics. Liberty University had a steady stream of interns in federal offices that are in the George W. Bush administration, because they're right nearby in Northern Virginia. And there was one a Regent University graduate, what's his name? It was, I'm forgetting his last name, sorry, too old for this. But who actually became governor of Virginia. So yeah, they've been graduating law graduates who enter society, with an advanced degree in law for 25, 30 years now. And their impact has been felt, in populating the Christian right law firms that have been litigating the cases before the Supreme Court, are a major force in society.
Fred, I just want to echo again that gratitude that John expressed. And I know Lori, I think, is going around, and I don't know if anybody has any questions that you've written out. We have no brave souls, no questions about Project 2025 or anything regarding this moment that we're in. You're all good. Your questions have been answered. Everything is clear. You're not sure what to ask. Do you have a question you have written out? Or all right. But if there are any other questions, please do write them down. That's how we're going to give them to John, and we'll do it that way.
It's terrible. What's the relationship between the fear that appears to be driving this Christian nationalism movement? It seems like they're afraid, but there's also a message of the prosperity gospel. How are those two ideas intertwined? I don't understand what is driving this movement psychologically.
I'm not sure there's any one psychological motive here. Yeah, there are a lot of fears that are well articulated in the mainstream press about people losing their status in society, fear of the other, the immigrant, the status of women, all those kinds of things. Those are real for a lot of people. Prosperity gospel is a different kind of thing. And the prosperity gospel is the idea that you have to keep, giving money to the preacher, to the church. The more you give and the more it hurts, the more blessed you will be. And it's a very exploitive kind of thing. But some of those who practice prosperity gospel have also managed to position themselves into as power brokers. Paula White Cain is one of those, as are many people she's been affiliated with over the years. So it's the griftiness of Paula White Cain that attracted Donald Trump to her in the first place. So that's one thing. But in fact, some of the feeling is less of fear and more of empowerment, particularly among the New Apostolic Reformation kinds of people. If they feel that they really are God's chosen, and that they really are living in the end times and are going to be given increasing power to bring in the kingdom of God on God's behalf. And as I mentioned, perhaps in some violent storm, working with angels and being given supernatural powers. There are folks who live this all the time. It may sound like Marvel Comics, but in fact, this is a lived experience of a lot of people who find it deeply empowering. And that's to be taken very seriously. The paradox here is they're going out and being encouraged to engage in mundane activities with their neighbors and in their communities, but they're living this supernatural idea of satanic activity going on all around them. And that alone, that alienating factor alone is a lot of what we're now calling polarization. That's a lot more than polarization. This is a deeply divisive religious vision of religious war going on. And it's just a question of times when the apostles and prophets who speak directly to God and God through them, decide to give the order to get violent. Their violent rhetoric is just extraordinary and has escalated in the past couple of years that I've seen, to the point where it really is threatening to be destabilizing.
We have a card. Any other cards that, as that question was posed, as Fred was responding, that came to mind? Yeah, John, you want to do your best to read these?
Well, this is an interesting question, Fred. What standards can be used or established to identify those who are using this as a cover for personal gain? So how do you differentiate between a true disciple who really believes they're engaged in spiritual warfare and others who are sort of riding this wave for personal or political gain?
Well, I guess I have two responses to that is, and one is, I'm not sure you can always tell what's in people's hearts. And people go through in their life's spiritual journeys, times of doubt, times they've changed their mind, and normal human frailties and ambitions can sometimes come into play, and people could become predatory actors. These things happen. Other people are true believers. How do you tell? Well, you just sort of have to be wise and understand that there are such people, and that but whether they're true believers or not, people still do not have the right to become to treat others as second-class citizens, or to create political movements so that people become second-class citizens to advance their religious vision, no matter how pure, or their personal greed, no matter how base. For the purposes for the rest of us, it doesn't really matter. And if we're going to create a just society where we're all equal in the eyes of the law, and where religious freedom means the right to believe as you will and to change your mind, and it be unaffect and not for it not to affect your status as a citizen, which is the meaning of religious pluralism. You know, church and state is one of the means we have to preserve that religious freedom. If we're going to have that kind of society, we have to be careful of these people who, no matter how pure their motives might be, are in fact malevolent bad actors against democracy.
Well, we have an obligation to make an effort to be able to look out. We have to go on an individual basis. And if we have a right heart, a right spirit, then we can create that standard. For example, I keep thinking we should have a third political party that has no policy positions, but just character positions. And we'll decide who we let in and won't let in. We people in this room. Because we're right. Is there sufficient rightness to create something and provide guidance in the face of a pretty organized?
I'm going to invite our internal conversation to take place next week when we're all together, and so please hold on to that. I want to first quote something that Fred said and then ask another question for Fred to reflect on. Fred started by saying that people don't have the right to treat others as second-class citizens, and then corrected himself and said something I think far more profound and brilliant than that. Nor do they have the right to create political movements designed to create a class of second-class citizens. That don't forget that when you leave here tonight. Fred, here's a question, quoting one of my favorite church researchers. I don't know if you're aware of Karen Armstrong in any of her books, but she's written what I think one of the most impactful books I've read since I graduated from seminary in '88, The Battle for God. And in that, she argues that this battle between religious zealots has been going on since faith existed, battles between the faithful and the unfaithful. She also points out that, this isn't a part of the question, that has not just Christian roots, but Islamic roots, Jewish roots, and other places where certain religious movements gained power for a time. And this has been going on for centuries, probably millennia. Is this the same play, or is this something new that we're seeing here?
Well, both. We see these kinds of human motives that occur, but we're in a very different place and time where communications are rapid and very substantial. Our institutions are huge. And I think that all of the mechanisms that we've created to try to build, to inoculate constitutional democracy in defense of religious freedom and pluralism and separation of church and state, they've taken a long time to put together. But the people who didn't like those things back when in the 18th century when the Constitution was written, their descendants still don't like them. But they've gotten wise. They've figured out how to interfere with those mechanisms so that things break down. And they've been able to find common cause with people who they religiously hated and have been in shooting wars with, where the Catholics and the fundamentalists were able to bridge their differences sufficiently to be able to create political coalitions that are functioning now to take apart those very kinds of protections, and have been able to stack the Supreme Court and a good bit of the Congress with their people to accomplish these things. They've outsmarted us. They've outorganized us. They've outspent us. And it's not because all of that stuff was inevitable. It's because, for the most part, those folks who support constitutional democracy and in all that it means, even those of us who may religiously and politically disagree, agree with one another, we've just accepted status quo thinking. And we've chosen to turn a blind eye to the threat to things that some of the values we hold most dear. I think it's not too late to address those things, although it's the circumstances are pretty tough right now. But what I've told audiences in the past is that, if you believe even half of the stuff that I've told you, you have to do the single hardest thing that people can do, and that is you have to change the way you do things. You have to change what you think. You have to change what you believe. You have to change what kinds of actions you're going to take based on the things that you learn. But that's the hardest job we face right now.
If there are no further questions, then Fred, I don't know if you have any just sort of final closing words that you would share as you think about, again, the season that we're in, moving toward the election, the movement that you've been speaking about tonight, words that you would leave us with. Next week, we're going to get into small groups here, those of us who can make it, and to begin to reflect and talk with one another again. How do we live in this moment? How do we who love peace, as Dr. King put it, learn to organize, commit to organizing ourselves as effectively as those who love war, so to speak, as those who seek to divide? What would you leave us with in this moment as we move forward?
Well, one thing is that even though I'm the designated deliverer of the bad news, I actually, as I said, I come with good news. And good news is, part of it is that when you look at just the sheer numbers of who is doing these things that are so disruptive, they're a very well organized minority, and that therefore there's a lot more of us in the broadest sense than there are of them. And I think part of the task for small groups is to figure out, all right, well, what are we going to do about that then? If there are more of us than there are of them, do we value all of us and the values of constitutional democracy and religious pluralism and all that, and respect for the faith of others, to figure out ways to aggressively defend against the people who want to end those things? That is within our reach. And I would say, as speaking to people from the United Church of Christ, you are you're the direct descendants, of the early Christians in this country. You have a democratic polity where you elect your own leaders and decide for yourselves what you're going to believe. Part of the task of this movement is to make sure that democratic polities don't exist. UCC churches have been taken over by apostles that end all the democratic functions in those churches. And people who are members of churches, there are fewer churches with democratic polities. And what's the effect of that? Well, there are fewer people who are learning how to function democratically. We're never going to learn Robert's Rules of Order or any of the other things about what it means to be elected to something, or to make or have rationales for making choices. The churches, the democratic polities have been foundational to the creation of the best aspirations and functioning of democracy. And I think to be able to articulate that, to value that, and to take that out into the public arena is a powerful tool. You're carrying forward a legacy that created the country as we come to understand it in all of its best aspirations. Others don't have that going for them. They don't agree with democracy in the church, and they don't agree with democracy outside the church either.
Well, thank you, Fred. I think we can give a round of applause and here a warm expression of gratitude. A couple things as we close up, as we wrap up our time together here tonight. The first is that, again, we'll gather in Dutton Hall back there next Tuesday, 6:30 to 8, for small group conversations to take this to the next level. So if you can join us for that, obviously that will not be live streamed. You'll need to be here to participate. So we invite you back for that. And this quote that I've lifted up here at Federated Church somewhat recently from Margaret Mead, and I think speaks to both the hope and, as Fred lifted up, the seriousness with which we need to face into this present moment, which is never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. And as Fred lifted up, this small group has had serious influence beyond its size. But it's also core part of democracy is the functioning of small groups like local churches. And that as many of us as there are around the country, that participation here is, as you just said, Fred, of in some ways we've maybe taken for granted that participation in UCC churches in particular, that we really have a democratic congregational, as we call it, polity. And that participation here is not, you're not outsourcing your faith to the pastor or someone else, but that it really only is in this little society what we make it. And so we might reflect on how do we create a little society, little communities here, who has power, who has voice, who can affect change, who can vote, that those are questions for us to think about within our own little society as we practice democracy here locally, that sort of prepares us as well to practice it out in the world. One last announcement that I want to lift up. Brooks Brent is hosting a UCC, United Church of Christ National Zoom meeting tomorrow at noon, and that'll be more focused on Project 2025. So if you have questions, want to go more in depth on that specifically, what it is and is not, that tomorrow at noon, if you go to ucc.org/justice, you can sign up for that. You can participate in that. So that'll be available there. Otherwise, I will share it afterwards. I'm sure it'll be on YouTube. There it is. There it is. So I encourage you to participate in that if you want to know more about Project 2025 in particular. With that, friends, thank you for being here. I invite you to go forth into the night. Why don't I just lift up a word of prayer as we close out our time together. God of love and justice, you who came into the world and showed us that way through one named Jesus, showed us that love is service to others, seeks compassion, is always trying to draw in others. God, give us the courage to risk living that message out loud in the world, even if there is a cost to it, knowing that that cost is too much for those who are more easily scapegoated and marginalized to bear alone, and that that is our calling, to bear witness to that as your people, to love in service of this world that you so love, to lift up the voices of all. We pray this in your name. Amen.
Thanks, Fred.
All right, well, thank you for being with us.
Fred, I appreciate it. I'll probably call you tomorrow and debrief a little. Thanks.
Okay.